Hi there. I'm Errol Kerr. I'm Chair of Student Council elect for years 2017 to 2018, and welcome to the NUTV debate live stream. With the general election coming up tomorrow, and with young voter or purported young voter turnout up to 51% from 43% in 2015, it's very important for, or at least it seems very important for politicians to engage with young voters. Now, because in response to this, we have two individuals. Hang on, I'm just pulling up details here. I apologise profusely. We have local Labour councillor Oskar Avery to my left here. And we have Conservative Society President Chris Murray. Hi there. During this debate, we will be covering a host of topics, from tuition fees, the future of the National Health Service, and minimum wage personal allowances. These topics will be very core to students, and I'll be giving each individual a chance to obviously discuss and debate these topics. As moderator, I will simply just be sitting here looking pretty, keeping an eye on everything. I suppose if you feel, should we just get straight to it, get started?
I'm happy with that.
Right then, tuition fees. Let's start with that. With promises of the abolition of tuition fees by Jeremy Corbyn, and the possibility of attempting to wipe tuition fees. And obviously, how do we feel that tuition fees, how are they really going to be affected in the long term as it stands?
Well, if I can just take this one here. First of all, I want to say thank you very much for moderating this debate, Errol. Thank you. Thank you very much, Oscar, for coming and being my opponent as well here. And also thanks to all the backroom team, NUTV, and everyone else who made this debate possible. So I think starting to look at tuition fees, they are necessary. The level they are at currently, 9,250, with a rise sort of in line with inflation, is necessary because that's how much on average it costs to put a student through university. So obviously, if we take away the tuition fees and we abolish them, there's going to be a huge black hole in terms of how we fund students going through university. And that hole is only going to be filled by higher taxes, which means that people who aren't even attending university are going to have to fork out for our education. I think it's much more fair that the people who actually use the service and go to university are the ones paying it.
Right, well, I mean, there's one thing I can just briefly correct Chris on, which is that actually the government already pays a big chunk of the cost of you going to university. So fees are not covering the full cost, and we're already asking people to make a contribution. Under Labour, we're quite happy that we're removing fees. And the reason that we're happy to do that is quite simple. So right now what we have is an unsustainable shell game. So you are loaned £9,250. That money goes straight to university, and there's then a loan taken out to pay for that. However, right now we anticipate that somewhere between 40% and 50% of that loan will never be paid back. That's because people will never earn enough to pay back that loan over the cost of the loan, and after 30 years it's going to be cancelled. So right now we're piling up unsustainable amounts of loan debt that we have no anticipation is going to be paid off. So there are two things that can either happen. One is that it creates a current black hole, exactly the black hole that you're talking about in government finances, or the second thing, which seems much more likely, is that the Conservatives will change the terms of that loan after you've taken it. That's already happened to some people through the student loans programme. Some of it's already been sold off to private companies, and they're not interested in helping out students. They're interested in turning a profit. So we already have a dysfunctional system that doesn't work. So rather than playing a shell game, we're going to do what the vast majority of developed countries do, what Germany does, what France does, which is to make university free. That's a simpler system. We're no longer be engaging in these sort of bizarre situations where you take out loans, but that loan has very little chance of being paid back, but you will still have £50,000 sitting under your name saying Oskar Avery, £50,000 in debt, holding you back, making it difficult for you to access mortgages, difficult for you to move up in your life. We want to change that right now. We're going to look at cancelling student debt as soon as we possibly can. We can make a concrete pledge. If Labour form the government, September, you will not be paying fees.
I mean, first of all, that is just not possible to push through legislation like that by September. Assuming Jeremy Corbyn, if he did win the election and was able to implement this plan, there's absolutely no chance he'd be able to do it that quickly, because you've got the summer recess, which lasts for many months. It's going to give him very little time to put it through by September. So realistically, that's just not feasible. He's going to be looking well into next year before he can even start to think about implementing these plans. Secondly, abolishing tuition fees alone costs £11 billion. That's almost a quarter of our entire deficit. So, I mean, are we really willing to pay £11 billion just to abolish tuition fees and get this plan through? I think that's too big a cost. I mean, we could be putting that £11 billion into so many other things. We could be putting it into the NHS. We could be putting it into mental health services and other important things like that. So I just think that's a ridiculous outlay.
Well, I mean, you might be able to make that point, Chris, if you were actually planning to spend that £11 billion on mental health. The Tories are planning to cut taxes for the richest people. They're planning to slim down our society, to smash the sides of the state. And we've been very clear about where that 11 billion is coming from. Everybody following on at home, you can go and read Labour's spending plan for yourself. It's 4 pages, it's not long. It lays out all of our spending commitments and how we intend to pay for them. Something notably the Conservative Party have not done. But you are not planning to spend that £11 billion to help people. That £11 billion right now is not going to help people. You're not intending to take this big pot of money and put it to public use. It's being filtered into the exact same kinds of tax giveaways that the Conservative Party has been quite happy to do for years. You're not proposing a huge increase in mental health funding. You are not proposing a huge increase in education funding. You're proposing to cut all those things.
First of all, we do have a strong mental health plan, which I assume we'll probably get onto later in more detail when we discuss the NHS. But actually, abolishing tuition fees is not going to, help the people at the bottom and the poorest end of society, as Oskar is trying to tell you here, because actually tuition fees at their current level is more advantageous for those people, because you're only going to pay them back once you earn over £21,000 a year, and you only have to pay, I believe, 9% on that. So most of the people who are even paying these back are going to be people in the middle class, people who are earning above the national average wage. So if you don't have the money to pay them back, I know it sounds like a lot of money. You've got 27 grand, nearly 28 grand now worth of uni debt plus the, I suppose, maintenance stuff. But realistically, unless you're earning enough to afford to pay it back, you don't have to. And it's going to be wiped after 30 years.
Well,
so,
you see, that's precisely my point, Chris. You're setting up debt that people won't pay back. So you're going to have this sort of Damocles hanging over you. Banks say, well, we can't lend you money because you have this debt. We don't think you're a good financial risk. And there's no real chance of you ever paying it back. So why are we setting up this system where fees go up and they continue to go up, right? Which just creates larger and larger amounts of money that will never be paid back. Why do you think that's a sensible or prudent financial model?
Because if we reduce the deficit and we, continue with a long-term and strong economic plan, we can afford to do that. Under your system, there is absolutely no way we can pay for all of the students to go through university. It would be far too big an outlay. And I know you mentioned that Labour's manifesto is costed, but actually there are several discrepancies within that, as has been pointed out in the media many times over the last few days since the manifestos came out. And actually, most notably, I think, is the fact that you don't have any kind of strong plan on where the money is coming from. It's all tied up in the future. It's all tied up in investment. It's tied up in tax hikes and making sure that people are the richest people pay more tax, when in fact that's not a guarantee. And whenever you try and raise corporation tax and income tax, you very rarely get the amount of revenue that the party who's doing it says you do. That's just a historical fact. It's very rare that that happens. And so Labour are relying on what is essentially a game of luck as to whether they will be able to raise this revenue from taxes. And if they don't, we're going to be billions and billions of dollars, and the British taxpayer is going to be billions and billions of dollars out of pocket.
I'll be allowing one more response before we move on to the next topic.
So I'll just say, I mean, obviously, right, Chris is correct in that to some extent budget forecasting is always to some extent speculative, right? But we have a very clear way that we've set out to pay for it. You can read it through for yourself, as I said, right? For example, reading straight off this thing that you can find yourself, 19.4 billion in 1 year from corporation tax. Right? And we might not hit that completely, but we've been honest about where the money's coming from. The Conservatives have failed to, as Theresa May has failed to show up to debates and failed to show up to interviews, have failed to tell you where the money is coming from. So you can say we're insufficiently clear, comparatively. Where's your money coming from? Where's your magic money tree that you keep complaining about that's going to pay for the promise that Michael Fallon made was that no higher rate taxpayer would have to pay any more tax under your parliament? Where's your magical money tree to pay for that, Chris?
Oh, well, can I respond to that?
You have a short time.
Okay, short time. Okay, well, actually, our manifesto is mostly costed. There is a lot of financial.
Mostly.
There is a lot of financial information, and the only reason that it's not entirely costed down to the penny and pound is because it's impossible to do that accurately. And we think, as a party, that actually we should be honest about the fact that we don't know, and it's impossible for anyone to predict exactly where every pound is going to come from and how we're going to raise it, because a lot of it is down to economic forecasting, as Oskar mentioned. Labour have just blatantly sort of misrepresented the facts and have tried to claim that they know where it's all coming from in order to reassure the taxpayer, when actually they really don't have any idea.
Right. Thank you very much for both of your comments. Firstly, I would like to note to any of our current viewers that should you send in any questions, these questions I'll be selecting these at the end of the session once everything has been discussed, and these will be obviously both confronted by both individuals sitting next to me. Comments I will attempt to read as we go. Now, on the screen I can see an individual noting not knowing who will be... I'll read these quickly from both individuals. One individual, not knowing who will be able to pay back university fee debt leaves a huge uncertainty and black hole in the finances. Followed by Murray says that fees do not deter people from attending uni, but Conservative cuts have meant a complete loss of maintenance grants, which a lot of students did need. Labour will bring them back. Another individual has commented, reduce the deficit. I'm sure Conservatives have had 7 years to sort it out and have just made it worse. Followed by Conservatives are relying on making the poor suffer even more, while the rich still receive tax cuts. There is a question there. I'll be leaving that to the end of the discussion. If anyone else has any more questions, please feed them in. Now, moving on to childcare support. Once we've graduated, once we've made it out of university, some of us may be looking towards, settling down, having a family, those kind of long-term thoughts. This time I will start with Oskar in regards to childcare support and how your party will support students looking to start their families.
So we've set out an ambitious set of proposals. And again, as I said before, they're fully costed, but we're planning to offer free childcare to every family who has children between the age of 2 and 4. Right, we think it is a problem right now that there are far too many people who can't afford quality childcare, and we know that that's the most effective investment in people's lives. When people who are falling behind at 2 and falling behind at 3 go on to underachieve educationally throughout their lives. So we think it's just quite reasonable to extend a universal provision to everyone. In the same way we have a universal provision in primary school, we have a universal provision in secondary school. We think it's just quite reasonable to have a universal provision in early years, so that's between 2 and 4. We also will protect and reinvest in the Sure Start centres, which are where most people get their nursery provision. Under Labour, that programme was started and rolled out across the country. It's now an unfortunate reality of the coalition and Conservative government that those centres are closing down, that provision is becoming harder and more expensive to find. We don't think it's reasonable to expect young families who are working to have to pay huge amounts of money for their childcare. In the same way, we don't think it'd be reasonable at all to expect people to pay for primary school. So what we're offering is really a helping hand to people in raising families and a move that will reduce educational inequality and help some of the youngest, most vulnerable young children in our society, help them to achieve. And we pair that with a proposal to have universal free primary school meals. Note that literally millions of children will go hungry this summer because schools will not be in. Millions of children go hungry every day. We think that's disgraceful. We think, given that we're the 6th richest country in the world, we can afford to ensure that every child who goes to primary school is properly fed. The Conservatives have responded by proposing free breakfast, but free breakfast costed at 7 pence a child. I don't know what they think they can get for 7p a child, but it is probably a scoop of Rice Krispies and that's it. We don't think that's enough to properly nourish young people and children. That's why we've proposed a fully funded proposal for breakfast and for lunches for all primary school children.
You say fully funded, and I assume you mean by hiking taxes up.
Yeah.
Which again, as I've already mentioned, I'm not going to harp on about this too much, but is not a reliable source of income for the future. But essentially, the coalition government has actually increased childcare provision over the last, over 2010 to 2015, and the Conservative government over 2015 to 17. We've increased childcare provision. We've rolled it out to the most vulnerable 2-year-olds, whereas previously only available to 3 and 4-year-olds in that capacity. And we're going to continue to do so. I actually really don't understand the whole point about nutritious meals that Oskar brought up there, because I went to a primary school, a state primary school, and I remember my meals being pretty awful. I remember turkey dinosaurs and turkey Twizzlers and the fishy whale things in breadcrumbs, all of this rubbish, which I'm pretty sure had not an ounce of goodness in it. So I don't think that the status quo, as in what primary school children are getting or have been getting historically, is actually very good quality anyway.
So what you're saying, Chris, is that under your government, school meals are so unhealthy that you don't want to feed them
No,
to children?
I'm saying quite the opposite.
Right.
I'm saying that was that's a historical thing of the Labour government. That's one of the legacies of the new Labour government.
What I would note, because when I went to school, that's before you had the move towards turkey Twizzlers, and it was a lot more nutritious. So I know that one of the few things that I'll praise the coalition government for was their progress that they made on turning school meals healthier. So I just don't think it's true now that the meals that children are eating at school are all deeply unhealthy. And even if that were true, that would not be an argument for not giving them to everyone, right? You still need food. Even if that food's not the best food, you still need something so that your stomach isn't growling all day, right? But that still doesn't seem like an argument for not feeding people.
Yes, but okay, but can I just respond to that? It's not that we're not feeding people. So what we're doing is we're removing the free school lunches, but we're lowering taxes and we're taking the most vulnerable people out of the tax bracket altogether so that they can afford to decide their own child's nutritional needs. And they can afford to buy their children lunches and send them to school with it, because they will have more disposable income as a result of not having to pay tax or as much tax. That seems like a perfectly valid economic system, and it gives the parents more autonomy and the state less autonomy over what the child is consuming. I think that's a great thing.
But you see, it's no child's fault if their parents are unemployed, Chris, and that will only affect people who are paying taxes. And indeed, those who are paying taxes now, lots of people already pay no income tax. So for the poorest children, you'll have no effect on their lives. And they're the children already who are going hungry. And many of them don't claim school meals because of the stigma associated with free school meals. Their parents sometimes would rather they go hungry than they be teased for being eligible for free school meals. We have a massive level of underclaiming in that programme now. I just don't think it's reasonable to say, well, we'd rather cut taxes for some people than feed children. It's not those children's fault that their parents are unemployed. It's not their children's fault of anything in society. None of it's their fault. We need to start by recognising that and making sure that not one child goes hungry if we can stop it.
Well, I mean, I think that actually, for example, you mentioned children whose parents are unemployed. They receive benefits which, compared to other G7 and European and actually countries generally in the world, we have a pretty generous welfare system. Okay, and admittedly there have been some cuts in that area over the last 7 years in order to reduce the budget deficit, but it is still a very generous system. And the only reason that we had to cut it in the first place was because it got so large and so over complicated under the Labour government that there was no option but to cut it and try and simplify it somewhat. But actually, people who genuinely can't afford to feed their children, people who don't have a job, there is help there for them in forms of benefits, unemployment benefits, child benefit, for example. And there are also bursaries provided by the schools, bursaries provided by the government. And in fact, one of the, going back to the tuition fee debate, just briefly, one of the caveats of the Conservative manifesto in allowing the tuition fees to stay at the same level is that universities who charge the maximum tuition fees have to engage in outreach programs with schools, and I'm sure that will help in regards to making sure that childcare support and nutrition in school meals is adequate.
I think anyone who says the UK's benefit system is generous is someone who's never had to use that system. And I would like to know why you think 1.2 million people have had to go to a charity to get food bank support. And you can only get that if you get a note written to you either by a welfare office or by another service in order to qualify for that. That's 1.2 million families every single year have to go and ask a charity for food, and you think our benefit system was too generous.
You mischaracterised what I said. I said it's relatively generous, which is, it's true, because it is more generous than many of the other countries that are our contemporary that we base and kind of that we interact with in terms of global trade and sort of that sort of thing. Compared to our rivals and our allies, we do have a relatively generous welfare system. On
that note, I would like to move on from the childcare support debate and look at the National Health Service. It is often stated that our health service is facing a crisis. It is, there are a lot of concerns, especially with students, with their physical and mental health. It's obviously right now, as it stands, there is like a purported mental health crisis within the student body across the nation. So at this point, over the next 5 years or further on, supporting students with a health service is paramount. How will your party focus on that?
I think you're totally right in saying that there is a mental health crisis. It's a sad fact that consecutive governments have put under the rug, and I think 25% of university students do suffer from a mental health condition during their tenure at university. So I think you're totally right in saying that that's something that really needs to be looked at. In terms of what we're going to do, I think the first thing to say, I'm sure Oscar's going to sit there in a couple of minutes and tell you about how we're trying to privatise the NHS, how we're trying to sell it to the companies and corporations, and that we don't care about the people and all that sort of stuff. That's what he's going to sit there and tell you. But in actual fact, that is just rhetoric. Political parties do it all the time, and this is what Labour are focusing on, because it's something that they've targeted as something that people believe in deeply, and quite rightly, because the National Health Service is something which is very important to all of us, and it's one of the best things about our country. So what I'm going to say is that actually that's not true. Healthcare is still state funded, it's not being privatised even remotely. All that's being privatised potentially or given to private companies is jobs like cleaning, things like that. The healthcare that you receive when you go into a hospital is not being privatised and will never be privatised by a Conservative government. It's merely the bureaucratic and the more menial jobs that are being contracted out to private companies. In terms of going back to the mental health thing quite quickly, the Conservative manifesto is very clear in that they admit that it has been put under the rug, and they admit that it needs to be looked at more closely. And in fact, one of the phrases used in the manifesto is, we are going to put mental health on parity with physical health. And I think that is one of the most important parts of the manifesto. And they're going to add funding to it over the next 5 years if we win the election. We're going to add lots of funding to it and make sure that actually it's taken more seriously. We're going to try and reduce waiting times. We're going to have more specialists and better training courses within the mental health kind of area. And I think that under a Conservative government, it will be thought of as more of an issue, and mental health provision will be thought of on the same level and kind of equal importance as physical health provision.
Right. So, because it's always dangerous to engage in pre-battle, that is, anticipating an argument and saying why it's untrue, because that person might not make that argument. I'm not going to say that the Tories are out to privatise the whole of the NHS, though I would note that today a £700 million deal has been signed for North East Somerset and Virgin Care, taking over large parts of ordinary NHS services and healthcare services and social care services in North East Somerset. So privatisation is clearly increasing, right? But I'm not going to strawman the Conservatives. I'm not going to claim that there's mass privatisation going on. But what is happening is simple neglect. So it's very well to say that you're going to take mental health seriously, that you're going to have a parity of esteem. But right now, if you need, on any given day, inpatient mental health care, that is a mental health hospital being admitted to one, Usually from Newcastle, you need to travel 200 or 300 miles to be able to access a bed. There are usually less than 20 across the entire country juvenile mental health inpatient beds, sometimes 0. I think that's completely unacceptable. And while it's absolutely true, I'll totally agree with you that successive governments have swept this under the carpet. It has got markedly worse. The number of mental health hospitals is down, the number of specialist units is down, the number of nurses, mental health nurses, is down. 1 in 5 of all nursing places is vacant, and that's higher for mental health nurses. It is shameful that you need to wait a month to see most GPs to get a booked in advance appointment. It is shameful that you might have to travel hundreds of miles to be able to go to inpatient care. It's shameful that children are being held in jail cells because there are no secure mental health units in which to hold them. And that is getting worse, and it's going to continue to get worse. More than 2/3 of trusts are running a budget deficit, right? As opposed to less than 10% before the Social Care Act in 2003, the Health and Social Care Act 2013. It is clearly getting worse. We had the first doctor strike in over 30 years. We had the worst health crisis this December that we have seen in decades. We have skyrocketing waiting times. We have collapsing morale, right? And a gradually decreasing share of national income is being spent on the health service. I don't think it has to be like this. We are the 6th richest country in the world. We don't have to live like this, right? We can do better. Under a Labour government, billions were spent on new hospitals, on increasing expenditure, on reducing waiting times. Remember when there was a national scandal that you had to wait 2 days to see your doctor, and someone complained to Tony Blair personally that they wanted to see a doctor more than 2 days later, and they couldn't because of this target, right? But that was because everybody got to see their doctor within 2 days, right? You would be delighted to get to see a doctor in 2 days now. It is just unfortunate. It's very easy to say that you're going to take mental health seriously, you're going to take health seriously, you're going to look after the NHS. The reality is, Jeremy Hunt has been the worst health secretary that I've ever known. I think most doctors have ever known. And this health service is in a terrible, deep crisis, and that needs really serious change to pull it out.
Well, in that case, why is your party not committing even more money to the NHS? In fact, our party is committing more in real terms than your party is. So, I mean, how do you plan to increase provision the way you're planning on, or you say you want to, with less funding than we're putting in?
Right. Again, we have a very clear commitment. People can go and check for themselves about the amount that we're paying. But to take one example, we propose to end the pay freeze for NHS staff. As I said just now, 1 in 5 nursing spaces is vacant. But that's a major driver of deficits because hospitals have to hire locum and agency nurses to fill those vacancies or have unmet positions. So that drives this deficit because it's more expensive. If you refuse to pay nurses more, and we have a situation where nurses are using food banks because they can't feed their children, how do you think you're going to recruit those 1 in 5 nurses that you need to fill that system if you don't give them a pay increase, Chris?
Well, through training, through advertisement, through getting people educated and interested in that sort of thing. No. Through getting people educated and interested in that sort of thing at an early age. And that's something which, again, I think successive governments have failed to do. And I think that actually what needs to happen and what the Conservative government will make happen is get people interested and advertise the fact that you can go into these sorts of careers and the benefits of going into these sorts of careers from an earlier age. That's another way to do it. Also, skilled immigration. I mean, I don't know. We're planning on debating immigration in this debate, but just to bring that point up quickly, I think that although we plan to lower immigration to the tens of thousands in order to decrease stress on public services like the NHS, which by the way Labour is not committing to doing, then we can also at the same time accept skilled immigration in order to fill these vacancies. There's not just a one solution to this problem. There are many solutions, and we're looking at all of them rather than just focusing on throwing money at things and seeing if it sticks.
I'm going to talk about the 2 solutions you just
May I just for a split second? Because immigration's not on the list, and I'll allow you to respond, but immigration is a topic that I would preferably at this precise moment do not want to focus on this last.
I'll be very brief. Amber Rudd says that foreign health professionals in NHS need to train their replacements and leave. I think you need to go and talk to Amber Rudd, Chris, and ask her why she wants to take skilled foreign professionals out of the NHS. I'd note that trying to reduce immigration to that huge level is almost certainly going to affect the NHS, right? But Chris says we need to get people interested at a young age, get them to train. And that's why Conservative government has removed bursaries from nurse training. Under a Labour government, it was free. Because we need nurses. We desperately need nurses. We need far more than we have now. So we made it free for you to go and train. So as many people as possible want to do it. Under a Tory government, that's been completely abolished. And because they were so confident about how popular this was, it was snuck through without any parliamentary debate, literally in the dead of night. Right? So I think, again, Chris needs to go and talk to his party and explain to him why they're wrong.
Well, actually, it's funny you say that. Okay. It's very easy for Oskar to sit here, I think, and whenever there's general election debates on, it's very easy for the Labour candidate to sit there often and say, well, we're going to make things free, or we made things free, or we're planning to make things free. Something about making things free, because that is essentially what Labour have been rattling out ever since this election was called, and it's just not feasible. At some point, you have to question, well, if we're making things free, then who's paying for them? And so Oskar is explaining that they're going to make things free, and they're going to put money into things. But again, there is no indication of where this money's coming from. And I can hark back to it again and again. He says the manifesto is costed, but it's not costed because it's based on unreliable projections and based on things that they can't possibly know. So again, realistically, the plans for the NHS that Labour is saying they are going to implement, I just can't see how that is going to happen. It's not safe. They're gambling with taxpayers' money. And I think that if the Labour government is installed and they try to do these things and they spend all this money, when we're all taxpayers in 10 years' time, we're going to really be hit hard by it.
I'll allow one more comment from the both of us before we move on to the next topic.
So in 2010, there was a nursing bursary. So going to become a nurse was mostly free for most people, and the vast majority of the costs were covered. And corporation tax was at the level that Labour is proposing to make it now. So we're not even putting it up. We're putting it back to where it was before the Tories took over. And note in 2010, our businesses were not fleeing in droves to other countries, and we were able to pay for nurses to be able to study without it costing them an arm and a leg. So Chris says, well, this is hugely unreasonable. We can never possibly do it. We were literally doing it 7 years ago before the Conservatives took in office. And he says, we can't be trusted with the budget. In 7 years, the Tories have borrowed more money than every Labour government put together, right? They tell you that they're going to slash the national debt, that we're the dangerous people who will pile up debt for our children. But the reality is austerity hasn't worked. You've borrowed even more, but you haven't even delivered services. You've slashed services and still increased the debt, which is pretty impressively terrible.
Okay, well, can I just respond to that? So I'm very glad you brought that up because I was itching for that point to come up. When you say that borrowing has increased, that is a reflection of the high level of the deficit that Labour left us with. The deficit in 2010, after Labour government with all of their borrowing and their increasing of the debt, was over £140 billion a year. That's the deficit. That's just how much we are borrowing every year. That's how much we're out of pocket every year in terms of our financial budget. The Tories, under the last 7 years, we're sure we haven't eliminated it completely, but we have brought it down to about 50 billion, which is a hell of a lot better than what it was in 2010. And the only reason that we have borrowed more is because the deficit was so high, which means we had to borrow more in the first place. But as soon as we clear the deficit, we will actually be able to start bringing that figure down. And then we'll be able to reduce the amount of interest, which, by the way, is about, I think, the 6th biggest expenditure of the government, is purely on the interest of the national debt. So that's money, £40 billion a year, that's not actually doing anything at all. And we'll be able to bring that down once we clear it. So I think that actually the whole, the borrowing's been higher under the Conservative government is just misrepresentation of what's happened, really.
Thank you very much, both of you. Firstly, I would like to thank all of you who are watching. I would also like to, if you would like to ask any questions, they will be asked at the end of this, as many as I can fire out before we leave. I do have two comments I can see there, one essentially from each side. We have Edward Gray saying, Add funding to the NHS, still waiting on that magical 350 million Boris Johnson promised Brexit voters, and Thomas Hussey saying Labour promised the world on childcare, education, and the NHS. And yes, the promises are very attractive. However, I think it is incredibly irresponsible to make such promises completely ignoring the complexities and difficulties of raining such enormous amounts of money. Again, please feel free to ask questions. I will be asking them at the end of this debate. Now, on the note of finding money, as it were, tax. We're going to specifically income corporation tax proposals. Like, how is this, like, as it stands? You know, as like how are you intending on affecting our economy in a positive manner with increases on corporation taxes, as it were, or how are we going to support general public services, looking at how we are taxing our public and our companies? If you want to start, Oskar, here.
So I've talked about this already, and as I said, from the spending plan that I keep mentioning to you that you can read for yourself, funding our future, we're proposing to return the level of corporation tax to what it was in 2010. That'll raise 19 billion. And it's really easy for Chris to say, well, that's just magic, right? Obviously, all of these economies will just flee to all of these other places where they pay more corporation tax. We have one of the lowest corporation tax rates in the world. Only Ireland is lower than ours among the EU developed states. So it's just scaremongering to suggest that there's going to be some enormous apocalyptic shift if we raise corporation tax a small amount to what it was when David Cameron was Prime Minister. We've also been quite clear about the sorts of people we expect to be paying more tax. We want to raise inheritance tax. We want to increase the amount that high-rate taxpayers pay. The Duke of Westminster inherited, without doing anything, more in a single year than the entire NHS budget, and he paid almost no tax on that thanks to trust laws. The Tories think that that's still too much and they want to reduce inheritance tax more. And Michael Farmer's made a personal guarantee the Duke of Westminster and everyone else in his tax bracket, they won't have to pay a penny more. Notably, he's not made that promise to anyone else, so any other tax bracket. It's only higher rate taxpayers who are worth the guarantee from the Conservative government, they won't have to pay more. We're comfortable asking those people to pay slightly more in order to sustain our society and end our crisis in schools, our crisis in the NHS, our crisis in the police service. I really think it's just bizarre for people to say that the only opportunity is for us to become a bargain basement tax haven. We have to cut everything, we have to cut down taxes, we need to give even lower taxes to corporations and the richest in society. I don't think it has to be like that. I think that Germany seems like they have a pretty good society. Their corporation tax is, I believe, about 7 or 8% higher than ours. It's higher in France, it's higher in Belgium, it's higher in the Netherlands. I think we'll be okay if it goes up a little bit.
A little bit. It's going to go up nearly 9%. That's not a little bit. And I'll tell you why it is true that companies will leave. You mentioned in 2010 that we had 26% corporation tax, which is what you're planning to put it up to, and countries didn't leave. And that's true. But the difference in this situation is that actually, when you put it down, the companies get used to this lower level of tax that they're paying, and the new companies that have come into the country, and especially into London, financial services companies, that sort of thing, they have got used to this new lower level of corporation tax. When you put it up again, it's going to be much more of a bite to them now than it would have been 10 or 15 years ago when it was at that level already. And yes, they will leave then, because since that time, emerging markets like Singapore, you've got Hong Kong, you've got all these places which are fantastic for companies to go, because they have low tax, they have many benefits for companies, they've got lots of law firms and other things which parts of the infrastructure they need to function there. So companies are likely to go, and maybe not all of them will go, but if a few of the largest companies consider going, and by the way, even if they consider going, it's going to have a detrimental impact on our currency and our economy. But if they actually go, they're going to take things with them, because as soon as a few of the biggest ones go, they're going to take the medium-sized ones and the smaller ones, and the subsidiary companies like law firms are going to go as well because their clients are off. So, I mean, realistically, companies are going to go, and we can't afford that. Financial services sector in our country is something that we are utterly reliant upon. We are utterly reliant upon banks, we're utterly reliant upon corporations, which is why our corporation tax is so low, because they fund our healthcare system, they fund our schools. And if they go off, we are not going to be able to fund our healthcare system and schools, however much money we throw at them. However big the magic money tree goes, we are not going to be able to make up that gap because that's how reliant we are upon them. So I know it's quite easy to say, to paint the corporations as the bad guy. And sure, maybe they're not the most altruistic sometimes. But I think in terms of providing for our kids and providing for our healthcare, we need them. We need to keep them here. And that can be done only through maintaining and lowering corporation tax.
So again, even at the 26%, we'll have the lowest corporation tax in the G7, right? But I'm glad that Chris is concerned about the risk of financial companies leaving the country. And that's why I think it's slightly odd that Theresa May threw in the towel before Brexit negotiations began and said we're coming out of the single market, we're coming out of the customs union, and therefore losing our automatic right to bank passporting. That is, for those who don't know, the right of British banks to operate in every other European country without having to pay tariffs or fees. Those are the things that keep financial services corporations in the City of London because they can operate across Europe. If it's true that's so important, and I agree it is, and that we'll be devastated by companies losing, why did Theresa May choose to give up that fight without a single shot being fired? That having led to Deutsche Bank, for example, having already moved units, virtually every large banking corporation already moving jobs overseas. So Chris has just told you how crucial financial services is, but yet their government thinks it was more important to appease the Daily Mail than to try and keep the critical access to European markets that those firms require.
Well, I mean, without getting into the whole Brexit debate, which I don't think we have time for, I would we don't. There we go. We don't. I will just quickly respond by saying that actually we need part of the reason that we are taking the Brexit strategy we are is because we want to have a global nation. That's a phrase that was used in our manifesto, and what I think it means is that we want to make sure that we have trade deals and we have financial allies and economic allies all over the world. We don't want to be focused on the small continent of Europe, which, by the way, we have been under previous Labour governments. We want to make sure that we take advantage of the emerging companies. You've got so many economies that are growing outside of Europe. You know, you've got Singapore, you've got Hong Kong, you've got places like even Nigeria, you've got places, Russia's coming back on, you've got places in South America, and we need to we need to take advantage of this. And by the way, can I just quickly correct Oskar on one thing he said? He said that we have the lowest corporation tax in the G7, even if we raised it to 26%. But America is actually thinking of lowering theirs by over 12%. I don't know if it's 12 or 13, I think it's one of the two. And so we won't actually for long, because they understand that in this kind of modern globalized world, we need access everywhere, and we need to keep companies within the country in order to protect jobs, in order to protect financial services industry, and protect public services.
On that note, I feel it's obviously we're running relatively short on time. I would like to move on to talking about minimum wage, personal allowances. A lot of students will be working jobs, whether it's to pay rent and bills, whether it's to pay for the nights out. You know, we will all, like, a lot of us will be working your minimum wage jobs, like, and a lot of us, whether it's if we can't work or if we're unable to due to, say, disability or mental, there will be personal allowances, there will be money provided to individuals. Obviously, I'm specifically thinking students here who aren't able to support themselves fully. As you've said, is there enough? Is there enough available to support students or working class individuals? Yes. I would like to start.
So I think some of the, and I'm not saying that Oskar is necessarily going to do this, but I think that some of the rhetoric by the Labour Party in this election about how the Tories only care about the rich and they don't care about the working class is really quite unfair, because what I've seen in the last 7 years is a lot of progress having been made by Conservative policies. And actually one of the things that I'm most excited about in the manifesto this time round, and most excited to see implemented hopefully when we win the election, is the increase in the personal free tax allowance to £12,500 by 2020. So that means that we're taking the lowest people, the people who earn the least, the most vulnerable people financially, out of income tax altogether. So they're not going to have that burden. And that will apply to students, that will apply to anyone who earns money below a level of £12,500 a year. So part-time jobs, I imagine student jobs, that sort of thing. You won't have to pay any tax whatsoever. And that's a Conservative policy, and that's something which I think will greatly advantage the people who are most vulnerable in society. Secondly, I think that generally the party platform of having low income tax is advantageous to people at the bottom end of society. because they're going to have more disposable income. You know, if I'm a millionaire, if I've got £1 million a year coming into the bank account, realistically, doesn't matter too much, like the money that I pay in tax. But if I'm earning £20,000 a year, every pound that I pay in tax and that can't be used for disposable income, that hurts. So, I mean, I think that is something which the Conservatives are absolutely going to champion. And I'm not sure if Oskar would like to respond.
Yeah, so under our tax proposals, 95% of people will pay no more tax than they pay now. So that's the vast, vast majority of students and the vast majority of the rest of society. And I think it's odd that he talks about students needing to work and how important it is for people to be able to work. But yet, under this government, they introduced a so-called living wage, which is not enough for you to live on in London, but that wage only applies to people over 25. Now, I'm not aware that 24-year-olds need less food than 26-year-olds. I'm not aware that their children have less needs. I'm not aware that their rent is any lower. And yet, they are treated as second-class workers. Under Labour, we're removing that straight away. We'll have one minimum wage for everyone, and everyone will have to be paid the same, rather than companies being encouraged to hire young people and then fire them when they get to 25, as happens now. I think that's disgraceful. I don't see why it is remotely reasonable to have a minimum wage at one level for one kind of worker and another for a different one. We also would reverse the awful policy by which young people are not eligible for housing benefit because they're expected to live with their parents. We don't think that's reasonable. I think if you need to and wish to go and pursue a career, you might need to live in a different part of the country. And I think that doesn't mean that if you become unemployed or you fall into a difficult situation, you shouldn't be eligible for for housing benefit. Note also that particularly for LGBT young people who may not have the best relationship with their parents, it's completely unreasonable to expect them to have to move back in with their parents. So what we think we're getting right now is not a fair deal for younger people. And under the Labour Party, we'd roll back some of that unfairness and extend a large number of benefits that are fully paid for, that are fully costed to help people. But we'd at least end that chronic unfairness right now.
Well, I'll tell you what I think is unfair is actually the unemployment that's going to be caused by Labour's economic plans. There is a balance with minimum wage. If it's too low, people can't afford to eat, people struggle to survive, and that's obviously awful, and we cannot have that happening. And on the other side, if you have a too high a minimum wage, small businesses are going to be so adversely affected that they're not going to be able to survive. I mean, already 1 in 5 small businesses actually survives for the first 5 years. It's a very low number of small businesses that are actually successful. If you force them to pay their workers a minimum wage of, say, 10, 11, 12 pounds an hour, if it goes much higher than the £9 that we want to put it to, or we're planning to put it to by 2020, which, by the way, was more than Labour offered at the last election and more than the SNP offered at the last election, then these small businesses are not going to be able to employ their workers, and they're going to have to downsize. They're going to fail ultimately because they don't have enough workforce to kind of keep functional. And what that means is that the companies that the Labour Party so hate, these big corporations, are just going to get even more of a monopoly over every industry, because small businesses just won't be able to compete under these plans. And unemployment, which by the way is at a very, I think, the lowest level for a number of decades under the Conservative government, is going to skyrocket because people just cannot afford, the employers cannot afford to pay their workers the amount of money that Labour is suggesting they can.
So every single time anyone ever proposes increasing the minimum wage, people say businesses will go out of business, they'll have to fire workers. That's exactly what was said when the Conservative Party proposed to make the increase that you've just talked about. So I don't know why £9.60 is this magical price point that's so beautifully, absolutely, perfectly found. And you say it was higher than Labour manifesto, much higher than the Conservative manifesto that made no proposal to increase the minimum wage. So again, these are just generic arguments that are always made anytime anyone wants to raise the minimum wage. It's higher in other countries. We're not proposing it got £12. We're proposing relatively modest increases, which are higher than what the Conservatives are proposing, but they are modest increases. The main thing is that we're removing the unfairness by which 24-year-olds and 26-year-olds are treated differently. But let's talk briefly about unemployment. So Chris says unemployment is at its lowest level in decades. That's because he's using the numbers of people who claim job seekers allowance. If you look at the actual number of people who are economically inactive, that is, people who don't work, that number has not moved dramatically. And considering we're out of recession, it should move fairly radically, and it hasn't. What they've succeeded in doing is making people so afraid of claiming benefits that they've been scared out of the system. And he might say, well, we've saved money, deficit's down, that's much better. But the reality is that people who desperately need help now have no certainty that they can get it. People who are terribly ill are rated as fit to work. People who are literally dying are told they need to go and work. And when I, Daniel Blake, was released, the Conservative ministers, none of whom bothered to go and see it, said that it was incredibly unrealistic. But I know as a councillor, and from all of my colleagues in local government, that those stories happen every single day. There are people who are terribly, terribly ill, who have to go to benefits appointments where they are bullied by staff and they're told that they're fit to work, even though they're literally dying, right? It's always going to be difficult to have a benefit system that removes fraud, but we can do better than this. We can do better than a system by which people with cancer, with terminal cancer, are told they're fit to work. People who can't raise their arms are told that they're fit to work. We don't need to have a system that bullies people, that bullies sick, terrified people out of the benefit system in order to bring down unemployment. I think we can do better than that as a country.
Chris, just to say, this will be, I apologise, but it'll be the last comment before we move to questions, if that's all right.
Okay, that's fine, yeah. So just to quickly respond to what Oskar has said there, I think the language he's used mischaracterises the frequency with which this occurs. In a country of 60-odd million people, you are always going to have people who, decisions that are made wrong, bureaucratic mistakes, people who slip through the net. You're always going to have that in any country and in any system. And so the fact that you've picked out a few isolated examples in order to challenge a nationwide policy just isn't right, because you mentioned scaremongering. That entire charade there was scaremongering. This is not as regular an occurrence as you make it out to be. Most people within the benefit system, within the welfare system, are treated fairly. The vast majority of cases are treated fairly and the right decision is reached. And it's only in a small minority of cases, which admittedly are awful, that happens. But ultimately, it's human error, and you cannot make sure that it happens the right way every single time. That wouldn't happen under a Labour government either. You would have exactly the same problem of people still slipping through the net.
Lovely. Thank you very much to the both of you. At this point, I'm going to move on to questions. If it's okay, Harris, could you scroll up, if that's all right? Because I think there were two in regards to one specific question, tuition fees. I think this will specifically go to Oskar. The direct question, would there be a cap on university places if tuition is free? Harris, can you scroll down so I could, because I'm trying to work out exactly, someone else worded it a different way. If tuition fees were to be abolished, would there be a cap? Can you guarantee there wouldn't be a cap?
Yes, there won't be a cap. There's no reason. We can straight up guarantee that there will not be a cap. In the vast majority of countries that have this policy, there is not a cap. We have identified, as I said, where the 11 billion is coming from. We will not introduce a cap on places.
Right. Well, that was short and sweet. I'll move on to a question to the both of you. Again, tuition fees. Will it lead to an oversaturated market of overqualified individuals? If so, is that a good or a bad thing for the economy and job market? Chris, I'll start with you.
Well, I think if you make the tuition fees, if you abolish tuition fees, like Labour wants to do, it's going to make it much easier for people to make the decision to come to university. And what is going to happen then is that you might get people coming here who don't really want to be here as much. The fact that we have to pay for it, certainly for me, the fact that I have to pay for it, £9,250 a year, it sort of incentivises me to work a bit harder and to actually realise that, what the value of university is. Which is something that, perhaps I didn't really always appreciate at school. I think that's a big difference because people who come here to university, and maybe if the tuition fees are abolished, they might not get that same feeling. They might sort of just come here because it's something to do, or it's a way to have a bit more fun, to make more friends, that sort of thing. So I think you're going to get a lot of people who actually don't really want to be here, and it's not good for them to be here under that system. To respond to the oversaturation of the market question, I think it's quite possible because lots of people will come out of university with degrees then, which aren't competitive within the market. we've already kind of seen, university degrees be somewhat undervalued in the market at the moment. I think that problem will get a lot worse if we abolish tuition fees.
Well, I don't think you can have it both ways, Chris. So you said when we were discussing fees that it was a modest repayment system, that it didn't put people off. Now you're saying the fact that it costs money puts people off and makes them think about it seriously. Either it's A or it's B. It can't be both. It can't both not people off, put people off, and put people off simultaneously. And I just don't think it's, I just don't think this talk about oversaturation is ludicrously overblown. Most other countries have a higher proportion of people going to university than we do. I think it's quite reasonable to have more people get those skills that they get from coming to university. And of course, people need to think about whether they think that's a good use of their time. But I don't think that it really is a realistic chance that we're going to have an oversaturation of market. Instead, what we're going to have is a level playing field by which everybody can go and make that decision to go to university. And it's not just the rich people who don't need to worry about it. Everybody will not need to worry about whether they can pay for it. And I think that's much fairer.
I have two questions. People have been messaging me privately, so I'll read these out. Firstly, to Chris, it's in regards to personal independence payments, specifically. Moving from disability living allowance and shifting those to personal independence payments. What was the, essentially this person is asking the justification or reasoning behind that?
I think that the reasoning behind that shift, as far as I understand it, is in order to make it more efficient. I think the current system is not the most efficient, as seen by government, and I think they've decided to make this move in order to kind of reduce the amount of time and effort and money spent on the bureaucratic side of things, and actually increase the effectiveness of the system itself.
Thank you. I was going to quickly move on because we've not got a lot of time. This question is, it's still in regards to, but it's to the both of you specifically. In regarding to, it's a little bit off that track, but in regarding to fit to work assessments, and specifically in regards to the essentially not getting payments until, say, if you're denied it and you appeal, and according to you will not receive payments up to there. Generally, there was a report published by the government a while back on that, which again, it doesn't specifically say that deaths or illnesses were caused by that, but there were arguable links drawn between, I cannot remember the name of this report off the top of my head, I apologise, in regards to fit to work assessments, in regards to reported possibly linked, according to the government, possibly linked, possibly not linked deaths. How would you respond to that? I'll start with Chris.
Well, we sort of had this a little, we touched on this earlier, and as I was saying, I think that there is obviously some link, because as I say, any system is going to have some faults, some flaws, some people to slip through. That's just a fact. It's going to happen whatever you do, and that's going to happen whether you have a Conservative government, a Labour government, a coalition, whatever. But I think that actually what we are doing with the fit to work assessments is we are trying to reduce the amount of people who falsely claim money and falsely claim benefits off the taxpayer, because people do that, and it's an awful thing to do, because the people who need this money are then being denied it because people are committing fraud in order to get it. And the previous system, which we had under the Labour government, was not robust enough to prevent this. And I think, although potentially, that, as you say, there's not actually any confirmed evidence of this link, it's quite speculative, and there's no indication that it's as widespread as Oskar made out earlier. We have clamped down on benefit fraud significantly, which frees up more money for people who genuinely need it.
Oskar would like to respond.
So I think it's important to be responsible when discussing this, and the clinical evidence is unclear. But here are some things we know. We know that stress makes you sick, and that the more stressed you are, the sicker you get, and the less likely you are to recover from relatively minor illnesses, the more likely you are to die from severe illnesses. So insofar as fitness to work assessments produce any additional stress, they will be killing people. Because fewer of them will survive, they'll be more stressed, they'll be less likely to survive. We know that. That's confirmed by all of the clinical evidence on stress. So we don't think it is reasonable to be piling stress on people who are already sick. That's why we've said that we'll have an urgent review of the system and pledging to change it markedly.
Well,
but in terms of PIP, you have people who are Paralympians who are disabled enough to compete at the Paralympics for this country, who Theresa May said we should be proud of, who this government has taken cars away from. And huge numbers of people who previously got transport support have had that taken away. I believe it's about 20% of people who previously got it had it taken away. And I don't understand how it can be the case that people who are disabled enough to compete in the Paralympics are not disabled enough for this government, taking away the things that they rely on to give them some dignity, some basic level. Right? It's very well to talk about fraud, but fraud has always been a tiny proportion of the welfare budget. And you've achieved that reduction in fraud by taking money away from lots of other people who are not claiming fraud, who have been too frightened to appeal.
I would like to, again, I'm cutting that short. Thank you very much. However, I would like to, and again, off the cuff, but here we go. I would like to offer both of you the opportunity to give like a closing statement of like a minute or so, and I will start with Oskar if you'd like to start that.
I think we can do better. I think we don't need to live like this. I don't think we need to live in a society where schools are having their budget cut, where 93% of schools will have a per pupil reduction in their budget under the Conservatives. We don't need to live in a world where we have a perpetual NHS crisis which is getting worse and worse. We don't need to live in a world with fewer police officers. We don't need to live in a world where 1 in 5 nurse places are vacant. We can do better. We don't need to live in a world where we're bullying welfare recipients, disabled and sick welfare recipients. We are the 6th richest country in the world. We can afford to do better. We can do things differently, and we must. It's terribly wrong, and we need to change it. And I hope that all of you can get out and vote and make your voices heard and vote Labour on June the 8th.
Thank you. Chris?
So I think that actually, Oskar says we need change, but he's not proposing a solid plan for this change. He's proposing an irresponsible plan and a divisive plan. Now more than ever, we need unity in our country over division. And a divided party like the Labour Party, where half the cabinet don't even support the leader and half the MPs rebel in every action, how can a divided party like that possibly bring unity to a divided country like ours, which is suffering from things like terrorism and global warming and economic recessions? With all these problems, how can such a divided party possibly bring unity to our country? Under Theresa May's Conservatives, what you will get is unity, because she has the backing of her party and she's going to take us out of the European Union. She has a strong and clear direction. She knows what we want to do. We want to become a global nation with global interests. We want to expand our horizons, and we want to make sure that the British people get the best deal possible.
Thank you very much, Chris. And again, thank you very much, Oskar, for both of your time. Thank you very much to everyone who's been watching this throughout. Tomorrow you've got a general election. You only get this chance, one every 5 years. As it stands, this is your chance to voice your democratic views. Get out there, vote.
Yep. Vote.
Thank you very much for watching.